It was the summer of 1943. The war in Europe had reached a breaking point. Cities burned, families scattered, and the sound of air raid sirens became the soundtrack of life. On the other side of the Atlantic, American soldiers were capturing thousands of German troops from North Africa and the European fronts. The world was changing fast, and these men, once proud, fierce soldiers, were now prisoners of war. For many of them, capture meant certain death. They had heard rumors about the Americans, monsters who tortured, who hated them simply for wearing a German uniform. When U.S. soldiers lined them up and marched them to waiting ships, they expected to face cruelty. But something strange happened. The Americans gave them food, cigarettes, even blankets. Confused and silent, they boarded the massive troop transport ships. Their destination was unknown. The voyage across the Atlantic was long and unsettling. The ocean stretched endlessly, dark and heavy under the gray skies. Some of the German prisoners stood on deck, watching the water crash against the hull. Others sat below, thinking about home, about mothers, wives, children they might never see again. For many, this was the first time they realized the war might truly be lost. Days passed. Then one morning, as the fog lifted, they saw land. It was the coast of America, vast, green, and peaceful. No bombed-out buildings, no ruins, no fear, just calm. For the German soldiers, it was like seeing another planet. One whispered quietly, "So this is where our enemy lives." When they arrived at the docks, the scene was strangely quiet. American guards waited with rifles, but their faces were not angry. They were firm, professional, and surprisingly calm. The German soldiers stepped off the ship, still expecting to be beaten, cursed, or spat on. None of that happened. Dock workers paused their labor and stared at them, not with hatred, but with curiosity. Many Americans had never seen a German up close before. The prisoners were loaded onto trains, long, dark trains that would take them deep into the heart of America. The journey took days. Through the small barred windows, they saw a country untouched by war. Farms stretched endlessly. Children played in open fields. Churches stood tall and white against blue skies. For men who had left behind a Europe drowned in smoke, this was unreal. One soldier, named Karl, wrote later in a notebook he hid in his boot. He said, "It felt as though we had fallen into a dream. We had destroyed half the world, yet here, life continued as if nothing had happened." The trains finally stopped in places most of them had never heard of: Texas, Alabama, Oklahoma, Nebraska. The camps were waiting, surrounded by barbed wire and tall wooden towers. The air smelled of grass and dust. As they stepped off the train, a strange silence fell again. A sign read, "Camp Hearn." Another, "Camp Swift." These names would become their homes for years to come. The first days inside were filled with fear and confusion. The men were searched, their pockets emptied, their belts taken away. They were given numbers instead of names. They expected beatings or harsh orders, but instead they were given clean clothes, soap, and meals, more food than many had eaten in weeks. Bread, meat, coffee, even pie. Some refused to eat, thinking it was a trick. Others wept quietly. At night, they lay on bunks, staring at the wooden ceilings, listening to the crickets outside. For the first time in months, they were not hearing bombs, not running from fire. Still, sleep did not come easily. The war had followed them in their dreams. Days turned into weeks. Slowly, the prisoners began to understand something. Life inside these American camps was not what they had imagined. The guards were strict, but fair. There were rules, but also routines. Breakfast at dawn, roll call, work assignments, and free hours in the evening. There were libraries, soccer fields, even classes to learn English. Karl, the young soldier from Hamburg, joined a small group of men who liked to draw. They found charcoal and paper and began sketching the camp, the fences, the watchtowers, the faces of their fellow prisoners. Art became a quiet rebellion, a way to stay human in a place meant to hold them still. Others found work in nearby farms, under guard but in open air. The Americans paid them a small wage in camp coupons, which they could use to buy tobacco, postcards, or soap. The first time a German prisoner stepped onto a Texas cotton field, he felt the sun on his back and the strange kindness of the farmer who greeted him with a nod instead of a gun. The Americans were cautious but curious. To them, these prisoners were enemies, yet also young men, not so different from their own sons. Local newspapers began to write stories. German soldiers help harvest crops. Housewives whispered, "They look polite." Children stared wide-eyed at the trucks carrying the prisoners to work. Inside the camp, life began to organize itself. The Germans elected spokesmen, arranged small orchestras, built wooden chapels, and even held theater plays. It was surreal. Soldiers who had once fought in the deserts of Africa were now painting scenery for stage shows in Texas. The guards watched in silence, maybe wondering if the war would ever end. But beneath the surface, fear remained. No one knew what was happening back home. Letters were rare, censored, and delayed for months. Some prisoners received news that their families were gone. Others never heard anything at all. The only connection to the world outside was the faint hum of American radio stations that drifted through the camp at night. As months passed, something deeper began to change. The German soldiers started to see America not as an enemy land, but as a mirror of what life could have been, peaceful, abundant, and full of ordinary dreams. They talked about it quietly amongst themselves. One said, "If we had grown up here, would we have gone to war at all?" The camp fences were still there, tall and sharp, but inside the prisoners began to feel free in small ways. Some wrote journals, some carved wooden figures of eagles and horses. Others learned English from old textbooks sent by local schools. The Americans encouraged it. Education, they said, was part of rehabilitation. Karl learned to say simple phrases. "Good morning. Thank you. How are you?" The first time he spoke English to a guard, the man laughed softly and replied, "You're getting better every day." For Karl, it was a strange and humbling feeling to be seen as a person, not just as an enemy. Still, nights were the hardest. When the sun set and the searchlights swept across the fences, the prisoners lay awake thinking of home. The sound of trains in the distance reminded them of Germany. The scent of pine trees after rain carried them back to their childhood villages. For some, the jolt was unbearable. They wondered how their families were surviving the bombings, whether their cities still existed. They wondered what their country had become while they were gone. And deep down, many feared they might never return. In one diary entry found years later, a prisoner wrote, "We were prisoners, yes, but in a strange way, we were also safe here. Safe from the war, safe from ourselves." The irony was heavy. They had come as soldiers, ready to die for a cause they barely understood. Now, behind American barbed wire, they had food, safety, and silence. For the first time in years, they had time to think. And somewhere beyond those fences, America continued to move. Farmers harvested their crops, children went to school, soldiers trained for the next battles overseas. Life in the land of the free went on almost untouched by the chaos that consumed the rest of the world. But for the men behind the fences, the war was not over. It lived in their memories, in their guilt, and in the fear of what awaited them when they finally went home. As the sun set over the quiet fields of Texas, the camp lights flickered on. The day ended, the night began, and the German prisoners of war, thousands of miles from home, lay in silence, wondering what tomorrow would bring. They didn't know it yet, but their years in America were only beginning. And behind those barbed wires, their hearts were already starting to change.
The sun rose over the Texas plains, golden and calm. For the German prisoners inside the camp, every morning began with the same sound: the whistle of the guards, the clang of metal doors, the echo of boots on gravel. They lined up in rows for roll call, faces half asleep, eyes still searching for meaning in this strange new life. The air smelled of dust and pine. Beyond the barbed wire fences, life looked free, fields stretching endlessly, birds gliding in the blue sky. Inside, everything was measured, numbered, and watched. But even in captivity, routine began to give shape to their days. Breakfast was served in long wooden halls. The food was plain but filling: oatmeal, bread, eggs, sometimes even coffee. The men ate in silence at first, suspicious of everything. But soon laughter returned, quiet and uncertain. Someone cracked a joke about American bread being too soft. Another whispered that he hadn't eaten this well since 1941. After breakfast came work assignments. Some prisoners were sent to nearby farms to help harvest cotton, wheat, and peanuts. Others stayed inside the camp, building furniture, repairing uniforms, or working in kitchens. The Geneva Convention allowed prisoners to work as long as it wasn't for military use. The Americans followed those rules carefully. It surprised the Germans. Many had expected cruelty, not fairness. Each man was paid a small amount in camp money, paper coupons printed by the U.S. Army. They could buy cigarettes, soap, toothpaste, or writing paper from the camp canteen. On Sundays, the camp orchestra played music under the open sky. Violins, accordions, even makeshift drums filled the air with a sound that felt almost like home. At first, the guards kept their distance. The war was still raging in Europe, and some had lost brothers and sons to German bullets. But as weeks turned to months, barriers began to soften. The guards noticed that most of the prisoners were just boys, 18, 19, barely men. They weren't monsters. They were frightened, confused, and far from home. Sometimes a guard would share a cigarette through the fence. Sometimes a short conversation would begin, just a few words about weather or family. For both sides, it was strange to see the enemy smile. Inside the camp, life slowly built its own rhythm. The Germans organized themselves into small groups by region: Bavarians with Bavarians, Prussians with Prussians. They built gardens between barracks, planting flowers and vegetables. They painted murals on wooden walls, scenes of mountains, forests, and villages they missed. Music became a lifeline. On warm evenings, songs drifted through the camp: folk tunes, military marches, and even soft lullabies. The sound carried across the fences and reached the nearby American town. Farmers working late in the fields would pause to listen. It was haunting and beautiful. A few of the local townspeople grew curious. They had been told the prisoners were dangerous Nazis, but the voices they heard through the night sounded human, gentle. Some began to send books and magazines to the camp library. Others donated instruments or old radios. The war felt far away here, replaced by something fragile and unexpected: understanding. Yet not everyone inside the camp felt peace. Among the prisoners were men still loyal to Hitler, men who refused to believe Germany could lose. They called themselves true believers and kept strict discipline. They watched others carefully, ready to punish anyone who questioned the Reich. They whispered that the Americans were trying to corrupt them. This created fear inside the fences. Some prisoners were caught between two worlds, trying to survive in America while still fearing their own comrades. There were secret fights at night, hidden notes, and even small acts of sabotage. The camp commandants knew about it, but tried to keep peace. They separated the hardliners from the rest, sending them to isolated compounds. Karl, the young artist from Hamburg, avoided trouble by keeping busy. He spent his days painting portraits of other prisoners and guards. One afternoon, an American officer noticed his drawings and asked him to paint a mural for the mess hall. Karl agreed. He painted a giant scene of rolling hills, clouds, and sunlight breaking through stormy skies. It reminded everyone of home, both Germans and Americans alike. The officer thanked him and said, "You've brought peace to this place, son." Karl didn't know what to say. He simply nodded, realizing that even in war, art could heal something deep inside. Outside the camp, America was still fighting. Newspapers carried headlines of battles in Italy, bombings in Berlin, and the D-Day invasion on the horizon. The prisoners followed the news with a mix of fear and disbelief. Some cheered quietly when Germany won small victories. Others felt their hearts sink as the tide of war turned against them. Letters from home were their only connection to another life. They came slowly, heavily censored, with entire lines blacked out by ink. Still, each letter was precious. One prisoner received a note from his mother saying, "The house is gone, but we are alive." Another read that his father had been killed on the Eastern Front. The barracks grew silent those nights. War had taken everything from them, except the faint hope that one day they would return home. The American guards noticed how deeply these letters affected the men. They started a small tradition. On mail day, the guards would give the prisoners extra time to read, to write, to sit quietly. Some even helped translate English letters sent by humanitarian groups. For a moment, the fences between them seemed invisible. As time passed, camp life became strangely normal. There were classes in mathematics, languages, and even carpentry. The U.S. Army brought in teachers and chaplains to help re-educate the prisoners, teaching them about democracy, freedom, and life beyond war. Some resisted, calling it propaganda. Others listened with quiet curiosity. For many, it was the first time they heard about a world without fear. They began to question everything they had been taught. "Maybe," one said, "we never really knew what freedom meant." By late 1944, the camps were almost like small towns. They had theaters, schools, gardens, and workshops. The prisoners built wooden furniture for local communities and helped repair bridges and barns destroyed by storms. The people of nearby towns began to depend on their work. Some even left small gifts, apples, bread, or letters slipped through the fence. Rumors spread among the prisoners that America would soon win the war. Some rejoiced quietly, others wept, not knowing what defeat would mean for their families. But no matter what they felt, life went on in the same rhythm. Morning roll call, work, meals, music, letters, and sleep. Carl often walked near the fence at sunset, sketchbook in hand. He watched the light fall over the horizon, the fields turning orange and gold. On the other side of the wire, children chased fireflies. He drew them carefully, trying to capture their laughter. This, he wrote in his notebook, is what peace looks like. But even peace had its price. Some prisoners began to dream of staying in America after the war. They spoke quietly about it, afraid to admit the thought aloud. "What if we never go back?" one whispered. "What if we've already found home here?" The idea was dangerous, yet it lingered, because in the heart of a land once called the enemy, many of these men were rediscovering what it meant to be human.
By the summer of 1944, the camps had changed. The fences were still there. The guards still watched from their towers, but inside those barbed wires, something unexpected was happening. The prisoners had started to build lives, not free lives, but human ones. The fear that had once filled the camp was slowly being replaced by routine, laughter, and even a quiet sense of belonging. The war was still far from over, but here, in the middle of America, a strange peace had taken root. The prisoners were working in the fields, harvesting cotton and corn, fixing fences, mending barns. They earned a few cents for every day's labor, money they could spend on small luxuries from the canteen, cigarettes, chocolate, postcards. And sometimes, while they worked, they met the people of America. At first, the locals were cautious. They had been told these men were dangerous Nazis. But the more they saw them, the less they believed it. The prisoners were polite, soft-spoken, and surprisingly grateful. They helped old farmers carry hay bales. They fixed tools without being asked. They greeted women with respectful nods. One woman in Texas, a farmer's wife named Mary, later told a reporter they were boys, just boys. You couldn't hate them after looking in their eyes. That was how the first friendships began. When the prisoners worked in the fields, they often shared lunches with American workers. A few words at first, broken English, shy smiles, nervous laughter. Then longer conversations followed. They spoke about weather, crops, music, and home. They compared family stories. Some even exchanged small gifts, a carved wooden toy from a prisoner, a piece of pie from a farmer's wife. For many of the Germans, it was the first time they had been treated not as enemies, but as human beings. Karl, the artist from Hamburg, found himself painting signs for local stores near the camp. The guards trusted him enough to let him work outside. He met townspeople who would stop and watch him draw. One young girl asked him to paint her dog. Another brought him apples from her family's orchard. In return, he gave her sketches of flowers and trees. She smiled shyly and said, "You're not what I expected." He didn't know what to say. In his notebook that night, he wrote, "For the first time in years, someone looked at me and did not see a soldier." But these simple human connections were not always welcomed. Some Americans disapproved. They said the prisoners were the enemy and should be kept apart. Rumors spread in small towns, stories of young women talking to German prisoners, of friendships that went too far. The U.S. Army quickly set rules: no personal contact, no gifts, no private conversations. But life doesn't always follow rules. In one camp in Louisiana, a farmer's daughter named Ellen met a young German named Hans while helping her father bring food to the workers. He was tall, quiet, and spoke broken English. They started talking about books, then about their families, then about dreams of life after the war. Every time she came, they spoke a little longer. A few weeks later, she began slipping letters through the fence. He wrote back, carefully, in English. Their friendship turned into something deeper. They both knew it was forbidden, but the heart doesn't ask for permission. One night, she left a small handkerchief at the fence. He kept it hidden under his pillow for months. Years later, Ellen said, "He was my enemy by country, but not by soul." Stories like theirs were rare, but not unheard of. Some were short-lived, discovered and punished. Others stayed secret, remembered only in letters that never made it home. But even the smallest connections changed how these men saw the world. They began to realize that the people they had been taught to hate were not so different from themselves. Inside the camps, the transformation continued. The prisoners organized schools, sports tournaments, and even an art exhibition. American officers sometimes attended, amazed at the talent and discipline of their captives. A soccer match between German prisoners and American guards became a local event. Hundreds of townspeople came to watch. When the Germans scored, the crowd cheered just as loudly. It was strange and beautiful. But even as the camps grew calmer, the war in Europe was turning darker. News came of D-Day, of Allied forces pushing into France, of German cities being bombed to ashes. The prisoners listened to the radio in silence. Some prayed for their families, others wept quietly in their bunks. Their country was falling, and they were powerless to stop it. Still, they found comfort in small things. In the evenings, the prisoners gathered around makeshift campfires, telling stories of home. They sang songs that echoed across the fields. Sometimes American guards would stand at a distance and listen. One night, a guard softly joined in, singing the tune without knowing the words. The prisoners smiled in the dark. Carl spent his days teaching art to younger prisoners, and his nights writing letters he could never send. He drew pictures of sunsets over the Texas plains, of smiling faces, of hands reaching across fences. He often thought about the people he met outside, the girl with the apples, the kind farmer, the officer who encouraged his art. He had come to America as a prisoner, but America was changing him. For some, the change went even deeper. A few prisoners began to question the beliefs they once fought for. They spoke openly about how they had been misled, how propaganda had shaped their lives. "We thought we were fighting for honor," one said, "but we were only fighting for pride." The camp chaplains noticed the shift. They held discussions about forgiveness, guilt, and redemption. Many prisoners attended, not out of faith, but out of need, to understand how they could live with what they had done. One Sunday, during a quiet service, the chaplain said, "You were soldiers once. Now you are men. What you do next will define who you truly are." The words stayed with them long after the service ended. That winter, the camp was covered in snow for the first time in years. The prisoners built snowmen, laughed, and threw snowballs at each other. For a brief moment, they forgot the war, the fences, and the fear. The guards watched and smiled. It was hard to remember that they were supposed to be enemies. But every joy was followed by a shadow. Some prisoners received final letters, news that their homes were gone, their families scattered. Others heard that Germany was collapsing, that surrender was near. Hope and sorrow lived side by side inside those fences. One evening, Carl sat alone sketching the fading light. He looked up at the stars and whispered, "When I go home, will I still be the same?" He didn't know the answer. None of them did. By early 1945, whispers of the war's end spread through the camp. The guards seemed lighter, the air less tense. Yet in that strange calm, the prisoners felt uneasy. Freedom was coming, but what would they return to? A ruined country? A broken family? A future they could no longer imagine? For some, the thought of leaving America was bittersweet. They had found kindness in the land of their enemies. They had seen compassion in the eyes of strangers. They had rediscovered pieces of humanity they thought lost forever. Some even said they would never forget this land. "We came as enemies," one prisoner wrote, "but America showed us what peace looks like." As spring approached, the camps were filled with rumors. The war would soon be over. The prisoners would be sent home. Some cheered, others fell silent. Carl walked once more to the fence where he had drawn so many sunsets. He touched the cold wire and looked beyond it, the wide, open world that had both imprisoned and healed him. The war was over. In May 1945, the news spread through the American prison camps like a wave. Germany had surrendered. The Third Reich was no more. The radios announced it first, then the newspapers, then the voices of the guards themselves. It's over. For a moment, there was silence. The prisoners stood still, many unable to speak. Some cheered, others cried. A few simply stared at the ground, realizing that everything they had once believed in had vanished overnight. Their country, their army, their world, it was all gone. In the Texas camp, Carl stood by the fence, watching the American flag flutter in the morning breeze. He thought of his family back in Hamburg, the streets he had walked as a young man, the laughter that once hilled his home. Now all of it felt like a dream swallowed by smoke. The guards walked among the prisoners with uncertain faces. For years they had watched over these men as enemies. Now, suddenly, the war that made them enemies no longer existed. That night, the camp was quiet. No music, no laughter, no arguments. Just the sound of the wind brushing against the barbed wires. The next morning, the camp commander called everyone to the yard. Thousands of German prisoners stood in neat rows beneath the sun. The commander read a short message from Washington. The conflict in Europe has ended. Arrangements will soon begin for the repatriation of all prisoners of war. Home. The word felt heavy. But what did home mean now? For many, it was a memory, not a place. Days turned into weeks, and the prisoners waited. Some were eager to go back. Others dreaded it. They knew that the Germany they would return to was in ruins. Cities were burned, families scattered, the once mighty nation broken. Meanwhile, life in the camps continued with an uneasy calm. The fences were still there, but the tension was gone. Guards and prisoners began talking more openly. They shared coffee, traded stories, even shook hands. One afternoon, Carl was invited by an American officer to help paint a mural on the wall of the mess hall. It was a simple scene, a sunrise over open fields. He said quietly, "We could all use a new dawn." Carl nodded. For the first time, he painted not as a prisoner, but as a man beginning again. In the evenings, the prisoners gathered to plan their futures. Some wanted to go home and rebuild. Others hoped to stay in America, though they knew it was impossible. One said softly, "We will go home with American hearts." By the end of summer, transport orders began to arrive. Trains would take them to ports. Ships would carry them across the Atlantic. Each week, another group left the camp. Each farewell felt heavier than the last. The Americans who had once guarded them now shook their hands. Farmers who had worked beside them came to say goodbye. Some brought small gifts, an old hat, a Bible, a family photo. "So you won't forget us," they said. One day, Carl received a letter from the farmer's daughter, the girl who had once given him apples. It read simply, "When the war ends, remember that not everyone on the other side was your enemy." He folded the letter carefully and kept it in his pocket. The final morning came like any other. Sunrise over the fields, the sound of boots on gravel, the rumble of a truck waiting at the gate. The prisoners lined up with their few belongings, a blanket, a book, a memory. As Carl stepped forward, he looked one last time at the place that had held him captive, and yet in some strange way had freed his heart. He remembered the laughter of the guards, the kindness of strangers, the sound of music drifting through the night. The American commander saluted him. "Good luck, Carl," he said. Carl hesitated, then returned the salute. "Thank you, sir, for everything." The truck drove away, kicking up dust that shimmered in the morning sun. Behind the fences, the camp slowly disappeared from view. Days later, the prisoners boarded ships bound for Europe. As the coastline of America faded into the mist, Carl stood on deck, holding the railing tight. The ocean stretched endlessly before him, a vast and uncertain path towards a broken homeland. But inside, he carried something he could never lose, the memory of unexpected kindness. Weeks later, when the ship reached Germany, the prisoners saw the ruins of their cities for the first time. Buildings were piles of ash, streets silent, children wandering among rubble. The air smelled of smoke and sorrow. Carl walked through what was left of Hamburg. His home was gone. His family missing. He found his mother's name on a list of survivors and traveled for days to a small town in northern Germany to find her. When they finally met, she wept in her arms. "You're alive," she whispered. He told her about the camp, about the Americans, about how he had seen humanity even in war. She listened, her eyes tired but filled with light. "Then you came home a better man," she said. In the months that followed, many former POWs struggled to rebuild their lives. They faced suspicion, poverty, and the ghosts of the past. But some carried lessons from their time in America, lessons of tolerance, humility, and peace. Carl began painting again. His new works were not of war, but of hope. Sunrises, children, wide-open fields. One painting, titled "The Fence and the Horizon," showed a single man standing before broken wires, looking towards the rising sun. It was displayed years later in a small German museum. When asked about it, Carl said, "I painted this for those who learned that kindness can survive even behind barbed wires." He wasn't alone. Across Germany, former POWs who had been held in America wrote books, gave interviews, and told stories of their experiences. They spoke of American guards who shared meals, of townspeople who showed compassion, of how they had found humanity in an unexpected place. Many said those years changed them forever. They had gone to war believing they knew the enemy. They returned knowing that the enemy was not a nation, but hatred itself. Years passed. The camps in America were dismantled, their wooden barracks torn down, their fences removed. Grass grew where soldiers once stood watch. Today, in some places, only small plaques remain. Quiet reminders of a time when enemies met and found friendship instead of fury. In one of those places, near the Texas plains, visitors still find traces of the camp. Locals tell stories passed down from their grandparents, stories of the German boys who worked the fields, who painted, who played music, who said thank you when they left. And sometimes, if you listen closely to the wind at sunset, you might almost hear them again. The faint echo of voices singing across time, across borders, across the memory of war. Carl lived long enough to see peace return to Europe. In his final years, he wrote a short memoir. The last line read, "They took me to America as a prisoner, but it was there, in captivity, that I learned what freedom truly means." The war had ended. The guns were silent. The flags were lowered. But among the millions who had suffered, a few carried something precious home. Proof that even in the darkest times, the light of humanity never goes out. And that, perhaps, was the quiet victory that history forgot to write.